understand. The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other. Before we figured out there were other people to kill, we just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, you know, in the colonies, the colonial elite, looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants, who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up, and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another, or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who were enslaved Africans and these quote-unquote white folks who were poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all getting played by these rich people. Right? So ultimately, the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans, right? Because at least they look like you. They sort of share some of the customs and the culture. So they all of a sudden create this thing called whiteness, and they say, now you're part of the club. Now we're going to let you testify in court, enter into contracts, vote, at least if you're a man, own a little bit of land, at least if you're a man, right? And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that, because you're too good for that. And we're going to take the white men, now called white men, and put them on the slave patrol to keep black people in line. This immigration drama that we have right now is only possible because we don't understand our own history. As a country, and particularly those of us of European descent, we have lied to ourselves about how we got here and for what reason. See, black folks know why they're here. Native peoples know why they're here and how they got here. A lot of Asian folk know, particularly if they're Chinese American, they know they got here because their ancestors were brought over to work on the railroads by the railroad barons who didn't care if thousands of them died laying track 19, 20 hours a day. But for those of us who are from Europe, we have this fiction that we've told, and we believe it, even though there's no truth to it. You know what the fiction is? It's two parts. Number one, we say things like, with regard to Mexicans coming over the border, with regard to immigrants coming over, but only that border. That's the only one we care about, right? The southern border. I find that interesting. We're not flipping out about Canada, right? We only care about that one border, forgetting for a minute that that border was created at the end of a war that was started on false pretense by this country, after which we jacked half of their country. And you weren't taught that in school either, because our history books aren't interested in telling the truth. They tell this very patriotic history that has no relationship to the fact. So that border is artificial. Mexican folk who are coming here, documented or not, let's be clear, are coming home. Their families were here before our families were here in almost every instance. But we forget that, and then we say things like, well, I don't mind them coming. I just want them to come legally like my people did. The hell does that even mean? Come legally? There was no law to break when our people came. The fact that we didn't break a law that didn't even exist, you don't get cookies for that. You don't get like a pat on the back and a gold star because your great, great, great whatever was law-abiding when there was no law that he could have violated, even if he wanted to. But we've told this lie that we came for these upstanding principles. So we'll say things like, well, you know, our people came for liberty and freedom. These people are just coming for stuff. They're just coming for jobs. They're just coming for health care. They're just coming for stuff. We came for high-minded principle, right? Because we believe that. What kind of third-grade version of American history is that, right? Like when Donald Trump says, well, Mexico's not sending their best. What the hell, you think Europe sent their best? Our people were the losers of Europe. The winners didn't get on the boat. You understand what I'm saying? The winners didn't leave. Why the hell would you leave if you were winning? Only the losers left because they had no choice. They were dying. They were starving. When we look around and we see today in our politics a rich white man
telling working class white people that their problem is brown people. We need to understand the historical pedigree of that. That is symbolic of the entire history of race and class politics in America. The history of rich white people telling working class and poor white people that their problem are black and brown people. Beginning in the 1600s, that is what happens. Prior to about 1670 or so, there was no such thing as the white race, at least not recognized as such, called as such. That is not what people of European descent were when they were in Europe. They were English, they were Irish, they were Scottish, they were whatever they were. They were not white. Only in the colonies do we become white, and for a very specific reason, because in those early years of the colonial period, where you had white indentured servants, one level above enslaved themselves, and you had African-descended folks, some of them enslaved for life, others indentured servants also in the earliest years of the colonies, those people would often see their interests as being common. They all realized that they were being screwed over by the same landowners, the same elite. They fomented various rebellions, like Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, others as well. And as a result, the elite in the colonies realized that they had to figure out a way to get the other folks from Europe on their teams. They created this mentality that said, you're now a member of the white race, you're on our team, you're wearing our uniform. Now you're at the end of the bench, you may not get in the game, but you're on our team.
You see, America didn't just wake up one day and it was broken, or it was everything that we are seeing not working today in America. No. What we are watching right now is a kind of reveal of the truth that has always been there. It's like a magician whose tricks have gone on for too long, and now the audience is starting to see the wires, the trapdoor, the misdirection, the illusion. And suddenly the people that were clapping the loudest because of the illusion of the magic tricks are suddenly beginning to look confused, or perhaps disgusted, because they are realizing the illusion in the tricks. But then meanwhile, at the corner of the room, there is a group that is not surprised at all, that they knew the illusion behind the magic tricks, and so they're not acting surprised at all. And perhaps in America, that group at the corner makes up for the Black Americans. And because we've seen them not surprised at all with what is going on in America today, especially under the leadership of Donald Trump, with everything so drastic happening. Now, that is exactly what this activist, Tim Wise, has been trying to talk about for ages. Now, let's listen a little longer, and I'll be back with some more good commentary.
The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, in the colonies, the colonial elite, looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants, who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up, and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another, or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who were enslaved Africans and these quote-unquote white folks who were poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all getting played by these rich people. Right? So ultimately, the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans, right? Because at least they look like you. They sort of share some of the customs and the culture. So they all of a sudden create this thing called whiteness, and they say, now you're part of the club. Now we're going to let you testify in court, enter into contracts, vote, at least if you're a man, own a little bit of land, at least if you're a man, right? And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that, because you're too good for that. And we're going to take the white men, now called white men, and put them on the slave patrol to keep black people in line. Give them a horse and a gun and a badge and make them feel big and powerful, right? They're still poor. They still don't have anything. They didn't pay the slave patrol well, right? Just exploited them, used them as a buffer between the elite and the other poor folks, particularly poor folks of color. And pretty soon the rebellions that occasionally happened where black and white got together to overthrow the elite, those stopped because the divide and conquer had begun to work, right? You could turn people against each other by telling those poor white folks, they got to keep these black people in line. And so that divide and conquer gets initiated in the colonies. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward to the Civil War era. And you have, I'm from the South, right? My people, the elite in my part of the country, right, actually announced that the reason they wanted to break away from the Union and possibly go to war with their brothers and sisters to the North was in order to maintain slavery and white supremacy. They said that at the time. We lie about it now. And we say it had nothing to do with that. But of course, at the time, they didn't have any shame about it, so they just said it openly. Right? The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new government was the great truth that the Negro was not the equal of the white man. So that's the reason the Confederacy was formed and existed. But here's the trick. If I'm rich and I want to go to war to protect my ownership in other human beings, my property, but you're poor and you don't own any enslaved people, why the hell would you go fight to protect my stuff? Because I'm a rich person. I'm not going to fight. Rich people don't go to war, right? Rich people get poor people to go to war for them, whether it's in 1860 or whether it's during the 1960s or whether it's today, right? Rich folks get doctors to write notes for them that say that they have heel spurs and that's why they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that shit because he's sitting in the White House right now, right? Oh, I can't go fight. I have heel spurs. Send some poor kids to do that for me, please, right? So that's been a long-standing tradition. So the rich have to figure out a way to convince the poor to go fight for them. But that's a hard thing. That's like a hard sell, right? Like how the hell, why would you do that? Why would you go fight to protect my property rights when you don't own anything? The only way you would do it is if that rich person comes to you and says, hey, listen, you gotta go fight because we gotta maintain our way of life because if these people get free, they're gonna take your jobs. No, fool, they already got your job. That's how it works, right? Because if I'm white and I got to charge you $1 a day to work on the farm, but you can get a black person to do it for nothing because you own them, guess who got the job? Free got the job, right? So in a sense, poor white folks would have been better off joining with black folks to overthrow the slave system. That would have raised the wage floor of all working people. But they got tricked by rich white men telling them that their enemies were black and brown. Fast forward to the 1930s. And you have white labor leaders. They're not even the elite, right? The labor leaders are not the elite, but they're the elite within the labor movement. And even they had fallen for it at this point. So they didn't want to integrate their unions. And they would say things like, well, we can't have black people and Mexicans and Chinese folks in our unions because if we do that, it's going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. We have to maintain the integrity of our profession. No, fool, you need more people in the damn union is what you need. And if you don't let those folks in, guess what happens when you go out on strike? Who is the boss going to use to replace you? They're going to replace you with the very same black and brown folks that you didn't want to work next to, right? And so at the end of and then you're going to blame them for taking your job rather than the white rich dude for giving it to them, right? Divide and conquer, telling not rich white folks that their enemies are black and brown. And now we fast forward to the president. We got the president of the United States becoming president on the basis of that same rhetoric. Telling not rich white folks that the reason they don't have a job is because Mexicans took them. So if the data says, and it does, that white folks on average have 15 times the net worth of black folks, 13 times the net worth of Latino folk, right? We just assume, well, we must have worked harder. Is that right? That's interesting because actually the black folks and brown folks have done some of the hardest work in this country ever since the country was founded. Were it not for the labor of African descended peoples, there would be no country at all. In fact, it was my family, white slave-owning family in the South that got black folks to do all the hard work because we were lazy asses and didn't want to work at all. White folks in the South on the plantation used to want to sit on the porch and drink mint juleps and have carriage rides rather than work, while black folks did all the real labor. And yet we decided that black folks are lazy, which I find fascinating. right? And then people write to me and say, well, these black people, they're just taking all the jobs. Okay, which is it, Precious? Because it can't be both. People of color can't take all the jobs and be lazy. I don't ask much of racists because I expect very little, but you cannot be lazy and take all the jobs. Are we at least clear on that? Like, if you took all the jobs, you were like the opposite of lazy. If you are indeed lazy, you probably did not even take one job, let alone all of them. So I just need racists to get their damn story straight. That's all I ask. I just don't like moving targets. That's all, right? But if I don't tell my daughter the truth, she defaults to the position of the culture, and then she can't understand what the problem is. The same is true with policing. You can't understand the Black Lives Matter movement and the importance of it if you don't know the history and the relationship between law enforcement and black and brown peoples. If you understood that history, you wouldn't ask one question about why this movement is necessary and why it's righteous. If you knew that history, but you don't know it, and it's not your fault. You weren't supposed to know it, and nobody taught it to you, right? So you don't have to know that modern policing traces back to slave patrols. That black folks' first experience with law enforcement was having, you know who? Working class and poor white folks on horseback going around keeping black folks in line on behalf of the rich master that owned all the property. That sounds a lot like modern policing, because ain't no rich people policing, right? It's working class folks who are out there protecting the property of rich people against the depredations of poor people. That's what modern policing is, and it traces back, and we know that's what modern policing is, by the way, because we will lock you up for 10 years for $100 worth of food stamp fraud, but if you take $12.5 trillion on Wall Street, 20% of the net worth of this country, you will not do 1 day in jail. So we know that law enforcement has got nothing to do with enforcing the law. It's got nothing to do with good people and bad people, lawbreakers and the law abiding. It only has to do with controlling certain people. And black and brown folks know it was cops who were involved in race riots and racial terrorism against black communities for the first 50 years of the 20th century. You didn't learn about that in class either, and that's not your fault. It wasn't taught, but in fact, every single year, just about from 1900 all the way to the 1930s, 1940s at least, there were race riots where white folks would just go into black communities, burn them to the ground, bomb them from the air like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, rip people out of their homes, beat them in the street, and police sat by, watched it happen, and participated. That doesn't mean that every cop in the modern era is like that, but it means that black folks can be excused for being not so clear on the decency of police in their communities because there's a history there. It was police who dragged black folks and white allies off of those sit-in stools at lunch counters in the South to enforce segregation. See, when your job is to enforce the law, and for most of American history the law was against you as a people, then enforcing the law means you are the first line of oppression. People of color know that history and need to be excused when they don't just get over it, because that continues. How do we know it continues? Very easy. We know from the data on racial profiling that black folks are twice as likely as white folks to be stopped and searched for drugs, even though white folks are more likely to have drugs on us on the occasions that we're searched. White folks use drugs and sell drugs at the same or higher rate than black folks and Latinos, and yet it is black folks and Latinos who in any given year make up 85 to 90% of the people who get arrested and incarcerated for a drug offense. See, people of color know that. And if we don't understand when black folks rise up and say Black Lives Matter. Well, what do you mean? All lives matter. Yes, sweetheart, I know they do. Yes, they do. And that is a totally irrelevant and unnecessary point to make. You see, you don't have to say all lives matter. We take that for granted. What we've never accepted in this country is that black and brown life matter. You have to proclaim that which is ignored, you see. That's why we have Black History Month right now and not White History Month. We don't have to have White History Month because we got May and June and July and August. And every other month where we learn about white folks, we don't have to call it that. See how slick that is? That's how white supremacy operates. You don't have to call it White History Month. You just call it history, literature, and theater, and poetry, and art. You don't have to racialize where it came from, right? That's what Molefi Asante at Temple calls universalizing the particular, which is the hallmark of Eurocentric thought. Right? Not everybody's experience is the same. And so when certain people have been left out of all, you have to call that out by name. Because see, we've always said all, then we didn't mean it. We said all men are created equal, and we didn't mean that shit. Right? We didn't mean women, but we didn't even mean all men. We said all, and it was a lie when we said it. right? And so in a sense, when you say Black Lives Matter, to respond with all lives matter would be like going in a time machine back to 1971. Y'all won't remember this, those who were students, those who were older will. Around 1970, 71, 72, the big phrase was black is beautiful, right? There was this desire to take back the beauty narrative from a beauty industry, fashion industry, glamour industry that had hijacked it and denigrated black physicality and beauty, right? So folks were saying black is beautiful to reclaim a sense of beauty for themselves. It'd be like getting in a time machine, going back to 1971, hearing somebody say black is beautiful and tapping them on the shoulder and going, but we're all beautiful in our own way. Yes, shut up, we know. Not the point. It'd be like going back to the early 80s when the HIV/AIDS crisis started. And it took several years for the President of the United States to even utter the word. Ronald Reagan didn't want to even utter the word, let alone cut loose with funding to deal with the problem, until his buddy Rock Hudson died of it. And then all of a sudden he was willing to talk about it a little bit, right? So for the first several years, what'd you have? You had activists out in the street. You had ACT UP, gay men's health crisis, out in the street demanding research and funding for HIV/AIDS, right? And what they were saying in effect was people with AIDS lives matter. That wasn't the actual phrase, and we didn't have hashtags, but that was essentially what they were saying, right? People with AIDS lives matter, and we need to pay attention, because right now we're not paying attention to that. And we don't seem to believe it as a society, so we need to start believing it. It would be like getting in a time machine, going back to 1983, 82, in the middle of an ACT UP event or a gay men's health crisis event, and shutting down the protest by saying, yeah, but what about pancreatic cancer? People die of all kinds of things, right? Sort of not the point. You have to proclaim that which is ignored. And if we know the history, we understand that, right? Because if we know the history, we know that it is indeed black life, and I would suggest brown life, life of color generally, indigenous life, that is usually denigrated, demeaned, ignored. On a sexual level, it's trans lives that are demeaned, ignored, right? It's women as women. So sometimes you got to proclaim that which is not in the obvious frame of reference. There's nothing pernicious about it. It's not about saying black lives are worth more than other lives. It's about, damn it, these lives actually do matter. And even though the history says they don't, we're here to tell you that they do. And there's nothing wrong about that at all. But if you don't know the history, it might seem untoward. And I get it. And again, it's not your fault that you don't know the history, but it is our responsibility to learn it and then apply it to what we see. Same is true with immigration. This immigration drama that we have right now is only possible because we don't understand our own history. As a country, and particularly those of us of European descent, we have lied to ourselves about how we got here and for what reason. See, black folks know why they're here. Native peoples know why they're here and how they got here. A lot of Asian folk know, particularly if they're Chinese American, they know they got here because their ancestors were brought over to work on the railroads by the railroad barons who didn't care if thousands of them died laying track 19, 20 hours a day. But for those of us who are from Europe, we have this fiction that we've told, and we believe it, even though there's no truth to it. You know what the fiction is? It's two parts. Number one, we say things like, with regard to Mexicans coming over the border, with regard to immigrants coming up, but only that border. That's the only one we care about, right? The southern border. I find that interesting. We're not flipping out about Canada, right? We don't have any of the Minutemen or the anti-immigrant groups sitting off the coast of Nova Scotia with a gun and a scope trying to like pick off the sneaky Canadians that are trying to sneak in here for our superior healthcare system, which after all would be a pretty stupid thing to do. But in any event, we only care about that one border, forgetting for a minute that that border was created at the end of a war that was started on false pretense by this country, after which we jacked half of their country. And you weren't taught that in school either, because our history books aren't interested in telling the truth. They tell this very patriotic history that has no relationship to the fact. So that border is artificial. Mexican folk who are coming here, documented or not, let's be clear, are coming home. Their families were here before our families were here in almost every instance. But we forget that, and then we say things like, well, I don't mind them coming. I just want them to come legally like my people did. The hell does that even mean? Come legally? There was no law to break when our people came. The fact that we didn't break a law that didn't even exist, you don't get cookies for that. You don't get like a pat on the back and a gold star because your great whatever was law abiding when there was no law that he could have violated even if he wanted to. But we've told this lie that we came for these upstanding principles. So we'll say things like, well, you know, our people came for liberty and freedom, democracy. These people are just coming for stuff. They're just coming for jobs. They're just coming for health care. They're just coming for stuff. We came for high-minded principle, right? Because we believe that. What kind of third-grade version of American history is that, right? Like when Donald Trump says, well, Mexico's not sending their best. What the hell, you think Europe sent their best? Europe, no, our people were the losers of Europe. I'm not trying to be an asshole. I'm just telling you the truth. Like, our people were the losers of Europe. The winners didn't get on the boat. You understand what I'm saying? The winners didn't leave. Why the hell would you leave if you were winning? Only the losers left because they had no choice. They were dying. They were starving. They couldn't support their families. A lot of them were convicts who were sold into indentured servitude to work for rich European people. They were barely above the level of a slave themselves. The idea that we had these we didn't believe in liberty and freedom. And we know that because once we got to the colonies, we set up the opposite of liberty and freedom. And I don't just mean that for like black folks and native folks. I mean, even for other white folks. Like, we spent most of the time in the early colonies trying to figure out who the witch was, right? It was like, well, you're not a Christian. Well, no, you're not a Christian. Well, no, you're not a Christian. I'm going to hang you from a tree. Really? Well, I'm going to drown you in the stream. Well, I'm going to set you on fire. Like, that wasn't liberty. The colonies were some of the least free places in the history of the cosmos. But we act like we came for liberty, and they're just here to take advantage. Let's be clear. Our people didn't come for liberty. They came for stuff. I'm just being honest. Like, when Donald Trump says Mexico's not sending their best. Okay, you think England sent their best? The hell? Like, y'all like that? Look, the people say, my family came over on the Mayflower. All right, shh. Why are you bragging, Buttercup? That is not... I don't know who was on the Mayflower, but I know who wasn't. The king. The king was not on the Mayflower. Nobody the king wanted to keep around was on the Mayflower. But we have this fictional narrative. It's almost like we believe sometime around 1642 there was a British father somewhere in England that got his family together around the fireplace in the morning and said, all right, here's the thing. I know we're doing pretty well. We got this big castle. We got all this gold. I know, it's brilliant, right? It's fantastic. We were at the King's Palace last week. Kids, you remember you played with his children out in the garden. Wasn't that great? Yeah, I know, it was amazing, wasn't it? It was great. Listen, that's all fine and good, but Daddy has an idea. My idea is as follows. Keep up, please. Keep up. Gather all your things. Not all of your things. We have a lot of things because we're doing really well. We're rich. We're powerful. Just gather up like a basket full of stuff, and we are going to get on a big boat. And by that, I mean a rickety old ship. Like, I don't even know if it's seaworthy. Like, it might sink. We might drown, get eaten by sharks, get robbed by pirates, get scurvy, die a horrible, miserable death on the open ocean. However, and this is the important part, it will be an adventure. So what do you say? That didn't happen, right? The winners didn't get on the boat. The winners had no reason to leave. And you know what? There's no shame in that. There's no shame at all in having been the losers. In fact, let me tell you something. There's something quite beautiful about the losers saying, we're done with losing and we're going to rebel against that and try to carve out a new life. But you know what? It's every bit as beautiful when folks in Mexico do it, and Guatemala do it, and Sri Lanka do it, and Vietnam do it, and Nigeria do it. And do any of us actually believe that if our families' countries of origin had been contiguous to the United States, that they wouldn't have come undocumented? Like, do we think my great-grandfather, who came as a Jewish immigrant from Russia in the early 1900s, like if Russia had been where Mexico is, do we actually want to believe that he would have said, well, I would love to be able to feed my family and keep them from dying, but there are these laws? No. He would have done what he had to do. So this whole thing about documented and undocumented is this artificial narrative too. First of all, who's documented and who's not is the result of laws passed by people in power. It has nothing to do with inherent morality or ethics. It has to do with power, straight power relationships, and any of our families would have done the same thing to keep our...
You know, for generations, Black Americans have been calling this out. Not quietly, not subtly, but loudly enough and consistently. But a muffled, voice will not be heard for far, too far. They spoke about the inequalities being part of the DNA of of the system in America. They pointed out at, housing discrimination, job barriers, a broken healthcare system, unequal education system. But what did they really get in return? Dismissal. Being labeled as people that love to complain and being told to just work a little harder and being told to trust the system because it was fair. Fast forward today under the stewardship or the leadership of Donald Trump, something has shifted, or something is definitely shifting. Not because he, as Donald Trump, has created a broken America, but because he has stopped pretending that the system wasn't broken from the very beginning. And that's that is a bitter truth. He has not broken America. America has been broken for all this time. He's just exposing the truth. And now voices that were once ignored are being echoed by the people who are just waking up to the truth. And people like Tim Wise, who I really respect his ideology very much, have been speaking about this despite him being a beneficiary of the system, a white person himself, for far too long. But it seems many people couldn't just realize the truth until maybe it's becoming too late. Now, I think here's the uncomfortable truth. What Tim Wise has been saying is not new information. It's just newly accepted, at least to some of the people or many of the people in America. Because for the longest time, America ran on a story, a narrative, a powerful one. Work hard, you will make it. Meritocracy, play by the rules, you will succeed. But the story has had conditions, unspoken ones. Because while some people are, scaling the ladder, going up, climbing the ladder, others were stuck in one place, or sometimes in worse situations, being pushed down or being used as the ladder by others to go up. And when they spoke about that unfairness, that inequality, they were ignored. Now, fast forward to today, the system is squeezing people who maybe once felt that they were protected by it, and we're talking about the working class, middle class, not so rich, or we can just say poor white Americans. And they are now feeling the pressures politically, economically, that Black people and other minorities have actually been navigating, talking about for generations, And suddenly the reaction is that of shock. But why? Because many thought that the system, or they were taught and told that the systems worked just not for some people, but for them they were safe. Now they're realizing something deeper. It wasn't really about the colors of their skins or race, especially. Race was a tool, a divider, a distraction. But the real structure, the real system is power. And not just power, but concentrated power. And when we talk about concentrated power, we're talking about an elite, a few elites on top of everyone else. And everyone else is just negotiating for scraps underneath the table. There are those that are far below the surface of the table, but there are those that are slightly closer. And, that's only been the difference for some time. That's now actually, being exposed. And that's why you're even getting some of these Trump supporters. They're now speaking out, not because the system has suddenly betrayed them overnight. It looks to them like it is an overnight betrayal, but because the truth is they finally, felt what it is like not to be protected by a system that you've always thought was going to protect you. But you see, the truth, especially for Black Americans, this moment isn't chaos. It is confirmation. And we have seen scenarios where when Donald Trump came to office, we started hearing of rumors of segregation coming back to America. And what was the reaction from Black Americans? They were like, bring it on. We are ready. In fact, we have seen it before in a worse situation than this, and now they feel they're even better prepared for it than they were in the past. So if they survived it in the past, now they are sure to be even better at surviving it. They did not panic because they have seen it all. And they have been saying it constantly recently with everything, the economic pressures, the political pressures, pressures being experienced in America. Because they've seen a lot, mass incarcerations, they have lived redlining, they have endured systemic exclusion across housing, healthcare, education, everything, So when these cracks begin to widen now or appear to widen, they don't panic. They just recognize a very familiar pattern, familiar situation. And now the illusion is struggling to hold because once enough people begin to see the trick, the illusion with the magician, then the magic trick usually stops working, Um, and that's where America is at right now. Not at the beginning of the problem, but at the moment where denial is becoming impossible, at the moment where hiding the truth has become impossible. So the real question isn't whether the system is actually broken. The real question is, now that more people can see it, what's going to happen next? Yeah, and so I throw that question to you. Let me know what you think about this, and if you like this video, this kind of content, give this video a thumbs up. If it is your first time coming across this channel, hit that subscribe button, and I'll really, really appreciate. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.